why we should care about that. So he's going to probably need a minute or two to get set up there. After he's done, we're going to have time to work on our projects again, okay?
I did that one. Did that line,
Did we ever figure out how we got it to work yesterday?
I did. You're the one that got it to work. It was, oh look. Looks like it's already working.
Yep, that's a good start.
Yeah, that's kind of wild. I actually don't even know how it's connecting. It might be Bluetooth. I don't know if it's. What's up?
This is mandatory, right?
It is not.
It's not? Bro, I'm over here tripping about that.
How, like, hey, how many times have I told you in the last 3 days that the final portfolio is optional? 1 time? 5 times?
I thought the outline
More than
was the
5
only
times?
one that was optional.
Huh?
I thought the outline was the only one that was optional. Because it doesn't say it on here. It says it on the
It
outline.
does.
No, it doesn't.
Go back.
I just wanted this for me. That's
It does. Click classwork. Click classwork. Scroll down. Optional. Oh my God! Look at those freaking letters. Whoa. It is optional. It is optional. Well, because I announced it in class, I said, due to the really short squished time span, I normally do this as an opportunity for people to kind of learn how to revise. We don't have time to do it. It's optional, meaning that if you want me to look at revised versions of your work to possibly revise your scores up, feel free to submit it. There's also a reflection in there. It's a 1,000-word reflection in that final portfolio, which is an opportunity for anybody hoping to get a better grade than they think they have, to write a reflection about the class and like actually pitch what you learned, like what you learned, like to tell me like, hey, I actually took a shitload away from this class, and this is what it is. Yep. So it's optional.
All right.
Oh yeah, you bet. I'm gonna be parked in there later after Evan's done, and you can absolutely see what you got.
All right, I don't want to take up too much of your guys' time. I know that we only have so many classroom hours to work on this stuff. I'm gonna try to cut it down as much as I could. If by some miracle you don't know me by now, I'm Evan Marshall. I sit up here in the front, and I wanted to do mine in person because I've taken a couple of public speaking courses. I really like teaching, and I have pretty bad camera shyness. So I figured this would be a way to sort of navigate that and still have it be like an open communication, like two-way, you can ask questions, that sort of deal. I do have an announcement. There are cookies arriving at 12:15 today. That's the soonest I could get them in. So if you guys want cookies, those are gonna be here later. That will be a little celebration.
Bribery. Epic.
The rhetoric is showing.
All right, as you can see, my topic here is climate communication, kind of what this whole class has been about. It's gonna go into some narrower detail on some aspects and kind of be general review on what we can do and what we need to work on. This is my signposting. So first we're gonna look at what the USA is doing. What are our climate emissions? What are our policies? All that kind of stuff. We're gonna look at who's at the forefront, who's emitting the least amount of climate problems, and what can we learn from them. Spoiler alert, it's communication. We're gonna learn about how that's important and why it's important for the people who are succeeding with a lot of sustainability practices. And finally, the call to action. That's gonna be how we can follow these examples and implement that into our daily lives. All right. Out of 62 countries which contribute to 92% of greenhouse gas emissions, where do you think the USA placed, with 1 being the best and 62 being the worst? Because we know we're not the best, we know we're not the worst. Where do we think that is? All right, we
I
got
say in the
some
40s.
40s, 50s? 20? All right. We've got the first third here. We've got Denmark, Sweden, the UK. All right, so we've got some countries that are kind of known for trying to be sustainable. That makes sense being up here at the front. You can see they've got a lot more climate policy. They've worked hard to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Moving into the next third, we've got a different batch of countries. Indonesia, Cyprus, Bulgaria. So we've got a different mix here. We're still not seeing the US. We've got China here at the bottom, you know, that place where we see the photos of where it's just smog-filled cities and people can't breathe. And we're still not up here. That means we're underneath China somewhere. 52.
Oh, 54.
54 was very close. We are number 52, which means 82% of the countries that emit greenhouse gas emissions emit less than us. We are very high up on this ranking, which is not a good thing. We don't want a high number. That means we're doing very bad. This is where it comes from. Most of the countries lower on that list have a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's what leads to a lot of their high scores. We can see just about 1/4 goes into transportation, power, and industry, and then commercial and residential is that last factor there. And what are we doing about it? Because we know we've been trying some things lately, trying to pretend that we're sustainable. The biggest thing we've done so far is their Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most broad environmental legislation to date. There's a total of 40 billion direct funding. There was another almost 700 billion of funding that's going to be used for like tax repayments, incentives to get people to want to be sustainable in these countries to move to a more sustainable section. 14 billion, that's the biggest chunk of money that's going directly into greenhouse gas emission reduction efforts. So, you know, switching to solar power, all that kind of stuff. And then the next biggest aspect is actually really important. 10 billion in rural sustainability development. And we know that a lot of urban centers, they have a lot of sustainability. We have a lot more solar power, even in like the store's campus, you know, the light posts, you can see the solar panels on them. The reason that the rural communities don't have that is because they don't have the infrastructure for it. Their power grids are literally not built to have cleaner energy going through them. So a good portion of this money is going to helping sort of stabilize and equalize all of the sustainability efforts. We can see the EPA budget over the last couple of years. Up until this act was signed into law, this was about 16 to 17 billion. And after this law, we've got 76 and 83 billion. That is a monumental jump. That is a huge jump. That is almost what, like 5 times that budget? And that is 0.6% of our budget spending. Of our federal budget spending, that's not 6%, that is 0.6% makes that big jump. It kind of makes you wonder what we're spending the other money on. Let's look at the other role models. Anyone want to guess where this is? There's some context clues if you look close enough. No? That was a hand, not a hand? It is Sweden. You've got the Swedish flag right there. That was a good, yeah. Why other countries don't suck the way that we do? We have a direct comparison here. This gray line is what we need for the Paris Treaty. If you guys are familiar, that was a huge meeting with a lot of countries saying like, this is the path that we need to take in order to not exceed X amount of Celsius degree warming. And Sweden, you can see here, they're well below their gray line. They've had a lot more fluctuation, but they are below even their final target. And we're still like 20 years away from that goal, and they are below the target that they need to be at. Whereas you see up here, we are not. We are barely going down at all. That is not equivalent to that line, and we're not gonna reach that yellow dot. Even with, you can see here, that's where, I mean, that was COVID, but even with the Inflation Reduction Act, we're still not getting there. We're not doing good, and they are. That's the big point of this slide. Why? It's a big question of why this happens. We can see over here, we've got a Scandinavian nice little dorm room, right? I lied, that's a prison cell. That's what they look like. They look nice. Because they have such a smaller population, the countries have more responsibility for the people that live there. You know, I have more responsibility to you guys than the other people on campus because I see you every day, right? This creates a lot of trust and expectance to be transparent and understanding. So they're working on getting people into their community and feeling involved. That's why they have so much care for rehabilitation instead of punishment. And because everyone's willing to compromise, there are more political groups that represent the interests of the people. These groups have a lot more power than corporation, lobbying. If you're in a small city of, like 300 people, and you're voting and you see something that says, Amazon wants you to vote for less Amazon taxes. You're not gonna vote for that. You don't care, it's a big company, and these are people that you're spending your everyday lives with. You're not gonna be contributing to something outside of your community. That means that the policies that do happen are population driven. That girl, I don't know if anyone still recognizes her, that's Greta Thunberg from like 10 years ago when people started doing climate walkouts. Since it's easier to create compromise and accurately enact policy, we see more follow through from government agencies and communities, which makes it easier to see the results of policies directly, which we saw with a lot of that fluctuation in the way that they are well below their climate target. They're doing fantastic with sustainability. Who remembers what this is called?
IRA.
Yes, the Inflation Reduction
I
Act.
should have shut my mouth. Sorry.
That's okay, you've read this a couple of times. Not once in the entire process, from the first time it was drafted up until the way that it was signed into federal law, was this voted by a Republican official. It was more or less a fluke, the fact that the Democrats held the majority of the chairs in those centers, that this IRA was signed into law. Studies by nonpartisan groups like Rhodium Group of New York City, which specializes in global climate statistics, and studies by universities like Princeton, all agree that the act should decrease emissions to 40% below our peak in 2005. These are people who they don't have incentives to make, Joe Biden the president for 8 more years. They don't have incentives one way or the other. They're doing studies just on their own, finding that the IRA is going to help us decrease our emissions. Climate change is bipartisan. We are all suffering. So why are our solutions deemed partisan? That's a big question we have to ask. This starts leading into our communication section. If we look at all of the media in Swedish cultures and the way that they trust their media, there's not a substantial difference between the left and the rights, the conservatives and the liberals. They all trust or distrust their sources about the same amount. You can see they really trust SVT, and they both really distrust Naya Tider, whoever that is. She's doing a poor job at convincing anybody that she's trustworthy, but we can see that they trust people the same. They're getting the same information, and they're not pointing fingers the same way that we do. We can see that over here, because with the Democrats, 70% trust CNN, and 77% distrust Fox. The Republicans, 75 trust Fox, and 67 distrust CNN. So immediately you can see the difference between these people. They are coming together, they're getting the same information, they're not pointing fingers. And then over here we have us, and we're not getting the same information because we are distrusting the opinions that we don't want to hear. It creates a huge divide in what we're getting. This connects into a lot of our readings that we've done, or the optional readings if maybe that wasn't your priority. But we've got the grassroots hostility. Debate is an excuse to fling insults. We have manufactured scientific controversy, where if you can influence an argument one way or the other, you can get profit, whether that's political, social, or just money profit. We've got information filtering. In information era, people are gonna start liking the information that agrees with them a little bit more, and they're not gonna be listening to the ones outside of that. And then the echo chambers and the epistemic bubbles, we can see that divide with the way that people are only listening to their slant of media. Our climate is suffering because of our policy, which is suffering because of our media. It is all connected. It's all a direct line. What do we do about it? I've talked a little doom and gloom, why Sweden is good, why America is bad. Here's a little bit of a path line we can take to try to resolve this. We think critically. This has been a huge part of our lessons so far. Encouraging and teaching critical thinking allows us to analyze and understand incentives, and we can discern bias and get more credible information. If we all get that credible information, we get a ground level. We begin to weed out opinion and fact and have a more foundational understanding and less opinions that are forming our biases. Once we have the same information, we can start to understand the other side. We're not going to disagree just because someone has a different identity, a different label than us. We're going to have the same information, so we're going to see how values can interpret those informations and how we can resolve this, which is going to bring us to compromise. Understanding facilitates agreements, getting us to more solutions to target the problems that everyone is most interested in solving. And once everyone is able to solve those, we can start to grow our solutions to new problems, right? We can start to solve problems with each other. But you can't have any of these if you don't have a step before it. You can't create a solution that everyone's on board with if you can't get people on board with the information that the policies are founded on. So we have a really interesting dilemma here of we need to start from the bottom. We have to begin to encourage critical thinking, which is a large portion of this class. But that doesn't just have to be college critical thinking. It can be telling sixth graders that, you know, a website made in 1990 might not have the most relevant information. It can be things like analyzing the biases in photography and media and news, analyzing the rhetoric, stuff like that. It doesn't have to be complicated. But if we can build that first step, we can start chugging along into the other sections and building ourselves to a more cohesive and a more cohesive community. This was a quote that was just in the template that I picked, but I like it, so I kept it. The earth is what we all have in common. I think we can all agree with that. And if we don't figure out that we all have that in common, if we don't come to a common ground, we're not going to be able to reach the sustainability goals that we need in order to save ourselves from, you know, the devastating, what are they called? Climate. So like tsunamis, eruptions, earthquakes, all these are happening more. And if we don't fix our agreements, we're not going to be able to resolve that. It's going to get worse and worse. We've already seen it. This is the hottest summer we've ever had, and I know we've all been feeling it. If we don't come together, that's just going to keep happening. And these are a bunch of works cited. They look ugly because Kyle's the only one who has to read them. But this is the main takeaway I want us all to have. We have to come together, we have to think critically in order to build the rest of those steps so we can start following the examples of the other countries and build a more sustainable future. And thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
That's a really great quote. Lucky that just popped up there. That Barry quote. That's a fantastic quote. That's actually on one of my slide decks for a class similar to this. Because that's kind of the ethos of this entire class, right? Like finding a way to understand and engage and build bridges. So Wendell Berry. I have a question for you.
Sure.
Start the Q&A, right?
Yeah.
So my big question here, wonderfully done, like really well presented, really engaging, great slides, like it was fantastic. The big question mark for me is you're making the general argument, which I very much agree with, by the way, that it all starts with the media, right? The media is influencing us, it's influencing individuals, it's influencing politicians, it's influencing our policy, which is then influencing globally, country to country, it's influencing the action that's being taken. So when you were researching, did you find anything that demonstrated that Sweden's media is less biased, less paid off, less impactful?
That was one of the sources I found, not for my last assignment, but for this one actually. I found it was sort of just an examination of Sweden's media in general, like the trust and the mistrust. And it examined how, because the citizens have more, not parties, but more groups, they have more incentives, the corporate lobbying doesn't have as much power, doesn't have as much footing there because they don't have that greed to build on the way that we do.
Yeah, great. So would you then say that a big step that a country like the United States could take, grassroots individuals, right, would be to contact our legislators and make it known that we want some kind of policy initiatives to kind of limit the amount of bias in media? Like, what could they even do?
Absolutely. I think that's a very prominent goal, a very forward-thinking goal. And I'm worried that if we don't have the foundations of critical thinking to weed out knowing that information is biased, I think it's difficult for us to reach the step of then calling people saying we don't want it to be biased. But that is absolutely a step that needs to be taken once we've reached that critical thinking step, which as college students, I would hope that we're all, a little bit thinking critically, but absolutely, yeah.
Good. Awesome. For what it's worth, I agree with you. And I think like a lot of people have that knee-jerk reaction to like legislate bias out of media, and that can't really happen. It has to start with critical thinking. People have to be able to see it for themselves. Great.
Any other questions or comments? All right, cookies are coming at 12:15. You don't have to stay for them. That'll be more for me.
Okay, awesome. That was really great. Let's give them another round of applause. That was awesome. Good job. Really, really well done. And I expect every single one of your projects to now meet that threshold.